Before I get started with today's topic, just wanted to give you guys a quick update on the construction. The two 4x4, 8-foot long posts are now joined into a 16-foot post. I did that by drilling a hole down a foot into both the upper and lower 4x4, sliding them together with a 5/8-inch steel rod. So they aren't going to go anywhere. On the outside of it, I'm putting a metal plate in place to ensure that they don't move. So that all dropped into place, and I'll be able to get the panels up probably in another week. And get that first set of 400 up and test it out. Get the actuators in place. So in a week or two, I should have some information to update you guys on how the actuators and everything worked out. But this week, I wanted to follow up on what we talked about last week. Now, last week, if you remember, we talked about what you can do personally to help out fighting climate change. And there's a lot of things you can do personally, like what I did, getting your own solar station set up and pulling power in that way. You can also get something like that and pull it off the grid and off hours and use it when demand is high so that you're not adding to the extra power that's being pulled off of the grid. As another way that you can help your community. Now, that isn't necessarily helping out from climate change perspective, but it helps out the community because you're not pulling energy at the time that everybody else needs to pull energy. But another way to do it is to take a look at your power company and see what they're using for power sources. If they're using green sources, they're probably pretty proud of publishing that because they know that people are interested in that. For example, Green Mountain Power does not use anything that generates power using petroleum-based products. They aren't 100% renewable, but they're getting there. I think they're about 70 to 80% as of today. And they're going that route. And renewables means they've got solar panels that are being used. They've got waterfalls that are being used. Now, certain things will be different in certain areas of the country. Arizona probably doesn't have a lot of water power. There are a couple of dams there, but they probably aren't getting a lot of power from water versus what they could probably get from a nice solar farm in an arid area that just gets a lot of sun. As a matter of fact, I heard a study at one point about if they had put solar panels on the roof of every home in Arizona, they think it would generate enough power for 3 states. So for Arizona, plus a couple of extra states. So one way that you can help with climate change from the political standpoint is to pay attention to where your power company gets its power. Now, you may not have an option, right? Green Mountain Power is it for here. There isn't 2 or 3 power companies coming through that are using the lines, which can happen in certain areas. But take a look at where they're getting the power and choose the one that you think is the best out of the group. If you've got a situation like we have here where you only have one power company, see what you can do to encourage them to move away from petroleum-based and go with more renewables. And that might mean contacting the company directly. It also might mean contacting your legislature and seeing what they can do to help push that along. What tax breaks, for example, they could give them on a solar farm. All right? States are limited in their budget. They can't overspend the way the federal government can. However, they can offer tax breaks. That just means they're getting a little less money, but they're not giving away money. So it's not hitting your budget directly, it's an offset. And by putting something like that together, it could make the purchase of a plot of land to put a solar farm on more attractive. The other thing is, what are the zoning laws for solar farms? If they're considered to be what's typically taxed higher as commercial property, could it be changed to a different taxing setup? Is there a different taxing setup for solar? Or is it just commercial and residential and maybe farm? And there isn't that extra area in there for renewable energy sources, be it wind or solar. So that's another way that you could influence this. If your legislature does not have that extra category, why not? Get them to create that extra category, which would make it more attractive to put up some renewable energy. Now we know that there's more to the story than wind and solar generators. The stuff has to be stored. And again, having those storage facilities on a different taxing structure than, let's say, what's usually very high is commercial property, then it's got a built-in benefit to the company to make something like that, because it's already not going to cost them as much. The other thing to think of is, I know some areas are looking at creating community power sources. And that is, the power will flow into it, but the houses in the community pull from that localized storage. So rather than having this big area that has all these batteries and things in it that are pulling things out, it's less centralized. This decentralized approach means that if something happens to the transmission lines, because your power is coming from your neighborhood, the most that could be injured, blacked out, is your neighborhood. So having these decentralized cells of power sources, these batteries that are there, by having them separated, it means that unless the incoming power gets cut, and remember, even if the incoming power gets cut, you're still running off those batteries. But the biggest drain to the community would be the incoming power getting cut. However, you're always running off a battery anyway. You won't notice it, which means that they may get the power connected back up before you even notice that there's an issue with the power. On top of that, having these little localized areas of power means that your community is responsible for its power usage. By that I mean, if there is a overall issue with power usage, let's say between 5 p.m. and 8 p.m., people get home, turn on the air conditioning, start making dinner. If that's too much power drain on the grid there, it will be a lot of drain on the grid for your storage area. However, that community storage area that you have may not have that same pattern. If you've got some people who work the night shift, you probably get more power pulled in the morning. But again, that's your community's usage that you have to be concerned about, not the state's usage that you have to be concerned about. Because the power is going to flow in as the power flows in from these renewable sources. But by having that decentralized configuration, it means that you have power. Now, will those also be connected together? I don't know. I don't know what the end goal would be there, but you could connect a small community cell to the next community cell to the next community cell so that you're all sharing the power. Again, that means that if something happens to part of the grid, a good part of that grid could still be up and running. And because it's all running off a battery, everybody could be up and running. So instead of having a situation where you can't have heat because the power is going out, you're pulling the heat from your local collection of these power cells. Now, each one of these power storage cells could be just your community. It could be connected to another one next to you. It could be that you've got a dozen of them that are still active that you're connected to, even though the general power coming into it has been cut. So it gives you a way of keeping power running, but at the same time helping the climate because you're running off of these localized batteries as opposed to running off of a main powered grid. Now, that's not to say that these localized power centers wouldn't also have some grid power coming in to help supplement them. As I said, if you've got a high usage, then maybe the grid power gets brought in addition to the solar during those high usages for your section, 5 to 8 p.m., for example, and isn't needed the rest of the time. Or maybe it's needed overnight to just keep a reserve in the batteries. Let me explain that. So, my systems that I have, the EcoFlows, and I can't speak to other ones because I haven't used them, so we're just going to use the EcoFlows for this example. There's a couple of settings in there. One is, how low will I let this go? Now, because they're lithium ion, you don't want to go below 20%. So 20-25% is where you want it to turn itself off. How high do you want it to go? Well, the recommendation by the company is 90% of charge. Okay. That gives it a little wiggle room. If it gets too much charge in, it keeps you from overcharging the batteries. So I've got from 20 to 90%. That's one setting. The setting below it is, what do I want the reserve to be? So my Ultra, the big 6 kilowatt unit that I've got that set for 45%. Now what that means is above 45%, so from 45 to 90%, it's going to just use solar. If, however, it falls below that 45%, it's going to kick over and start using grid power. This is important because by having that in there, it means that I'll always have 45%, which is just under 3 kilowatts, minus the 20%. So I'll have 25% basically of the power. So 1.5 kilowatts in reserve should there be a problem. And it'll always be there because it's just going to pull from the grid. Until the grid goes off, that won't be an issue. Now you can change that. Those aren't fixed numbers. You can go up to 60%, 70%, 80% and say, okay, for the top 20%, just give me solar, and anything below that, pull it from the grid. If you were using this thing to just help offset those peak times that we talked about at the beginning of this, you could do that by just letting it pull a charge from the grid and turning it on and off. In other words, if you say you've got the backup reserve set for 45%, let's say, and you're using it right now to make dinner, it's going to pull down to that 45%, and it's not going to pull from the grid. But because you don't have solar, you would then say, okay, between 1 and 5 a.m., let's say, the grid is quiet. It doesn't have as much power being pulled from it. People are sleeping. I will set my device up so that at 1 o'clock, that backup turns off. I don't care about that setting anymore. Just pull from the grid. It will pull power from the grid until it hits that 90% threshold, and then it'll stop. You just flip it back on in the morning. When you're making dinner, it will just kick on. right? You're pulling it from there, and it's not grabbing it off the grid. So while it's another way you can personally help out, making sure that your power company can get the power from renewable sources, encouraging them to do so. Now, I'm not saying give them a permanent savings on certain things. You could have that secondary or tertiary or whatever level of taxation. But if you're going to give them a discount on the property, don't make it permanent, because after they've paid off the initial investments, they're going to be making money, and the community could use that extra money that they would have gotten if the discount weren't there. So if you're going to give your power company a discount, make sure there's a time limit to it. So let's say they're going to get a 10, 15-year discount on a solar field, which is probably more than enough time to pay for the solar installations and the batteries. But by being active with your legislature, by being active with your power companies, by being active in your choice of power company, if you have that option, this allows you to fight for climate on a larger scale than just the personal. That's not to say that doing it on the personal isn't important, because again, every little bit of savings that you make is savings off the grid. I've generated over 50 kilowatts so far in the last couple of months, and I don't have a huge setup. But that's 50 kilowatts of power that the grid didn't need to provide to me. But that's what I got for you guys this week. Next week, hopefully we'll have a little bit more construction news to go over. But I will talk to you all next week.